What if the system built to save Russian tanks never fired a single shot? I want you to picture 10 armored vehicles rolling across open ground in broad daylight, straight toward a line that was watching every single one of them. Before I tell you how it ended, smash that like button, because this channel is closing in on a milestone I genuinely want to hit with you. And if you know someone who follows this war closely, this is exactly the video to send them. Here's the deal. I'm going to keep with you for the next few minutes. I'm going to show you the footage first, then explain the 40-year story hiding behind it, and by the end, you'll understand something about this war that most headlines still get completely wrong. Let's get into it. Near a small village called Mayorsk, in Ukraine's Donetsk region, Russian command made a decision that felt almost nostalgic, a throwback to an earlier, more confident phase of this war. Instead of the small infiltration groups Russian units have leaned on for the past year, quiet men slipping forward on foot or on motorcycles, they sent a full mechanized column. 10 vehicles, moving together, in daylight, across open terrain toward Ukrainian positions. Somewhere above that column, unseen and unheard until it was already too late, Ukrainian drone operators were watching every meter of that approach unfold in real time. I need you to hold on to that image for a second, because everything that happens next only makes sense once you understand what that column was actually carrying. One of those 10 vehicles was a T-72B3A, an older Soviet-era design that Russian engineers had spent years quietly upgrading with something new, something Moscow had been promising its soldiers for a very long time. It's called Arena M, and on paper, it reads like the answer to almost everything that has gone wrong for Russian armor in this war. Picture a tank wrapped in its own personal bodyguard, one built entirely out of radar and small explosive charges. 12 launch tubes ring the turret, giving something close to full 360-degree coverage. The system is supposed to scan the space around the vehicle constantly, detect anything flying toward it, calculate a trajectory in a fraction of a second, and fire a tiny explosive charge to intercept the threat before it ever makes contact with the hull. On a spec sheet, that sounds close to unbeatable. It's worth knowing that active protection systems aren't some exotic Russian invention. Israel's trophy system has been protecting Merkava tanks in real combat for more than a decade, and the United States has spent years adapting versions of that same technology for its own Abrams fleet. Those systems have documented repeated successes against real anti-tank threats in real wars. When Russian state media framed Arena M as finally catching up to that standard, the comparison wasn't unreasonable on paper. The problem, as you're about to see, is that paper and a muddy field outside Mayorsk turned out to be two very different places. For years, cheap first-person view drones, the kind that can be built in a garage for a few $100s, have been quietly grinding down Russia's most expensive machines one at a time, and Arena M was supposed to finally close that gap. Officials confirmed earlier this year that a dedicated software mode had been completed specifically to counter small FPV drones, the exact category of weapon that has become the single most consistent tank killer of this entire conflict. When Russian state media proudly rolled out footage of frontline units receiving these newly upgraded tanks, the message was unmistakable. Finally, protection for the crews who have spent years burning inside their own vehicles. Finally, a real answer. And then came the footage from Mayorsk. Ukrainian drone footage, released by the National Guard's Omega Special Forces unit, shows the exact moment everything Russia promised simply failed to happen. An FPV drone, small, slow, and disposable, flew directly toward the rear of that T-72B3A, the thinnest, most vulnerable section of any tank, the exact spot every drone operator in this war has learned to aim for first. And Arena M, with its 12 launch tubes and its full radar coverage, did nothing. No detection, no interception, no response of any kind. The drone simply flew in and struck home. Think about what that moment actually looked like from the other side of the screen. Somewhere in a dugout or a basement close enough to the front to matter, a Ukrainian operator was watching a small, grainy video feed, one thumb on a joystick, waiting for the exact second the angle was right. No siren went off inside that tank. No radar warning lit up on any dashboard. The crew inside that T-72B3A had been told, in briefings and in state media segments alike, that this exact scenario was the one thing Arena M existed to prevent. Sit with that for a second, because this wasn't a system breaking down after weeks of grinding combat stress. This was the very first publicly documented combat test of the upgraded system against precisely the threat it was built to stop, and it failed completely, on camera, for the entire world to see within hours. Military analysts who have studied that footage keep coming back to one very specific, very technical explanation. And once you understand it, you'll see why this failure was never really a surprise at all. Arena M's radar was originally designed to catch fast, predictable threats, things like anti-tank guided missiles and rocket-propelled grenades, weapons that travel in relatively straight, high-speed lines. FPV drones are almost the exact opposite of that. They're small. They're comparatively slow. Many are built largely out of plastic and composite material, practically invisible to radar in the first place. In simple terms, the system was engineered to catch a speeding bullet, and instead it was asked to catch a paper airplane, one that barely registers on the sensor at all. A prominent Russian military analyst had actually raised this exact concern months before Mayorsk ever happened, warning publicly that the radar's fundamental design left it poorly suited to detecting smaller, slower drones. This wasn't an unpredictable accident. It was a known, documented weakness that Russian engineers either couldn't fix in time or simply chose not to. And here's the detail that turns this from an embarrassing news story into something genuinely remarkable. Arena, in one form or another, has been in development since the Soviet era. Early prototypes were tested all the way back in 1982. The modernized Arena M version was first shown publicly in 2018. Integration onto Russia's T-72 and T-90 fleets began around 2019, with full-scale deployment originally targeted for 2020. 5 years came and went without the program ever reaching real serial production. This is a defense project with more than 4 decades behind it, and it is still failing its very first genuine test against the cheapest, most widespread threat currently on the battlefield. Some analysts reviewing the footage have gone even further, suggesting the entire rollout may have been built more for propaganda than for battlefield readiness, a system paraded in front of cameras to reassure soldiers and civilians back home without the underlying engineering ever being properly finished. Whether or not that's the complete picture, the footage speaks for itself. A 4-decade-old defense program, updated, tested, and defeated inside a single clip lasting under 2 minutes. Now here's where this story stops being about one tank and starts being about an entire column. Because Arena M's failure, as dramatic as it looked on camera, was really just the opening act. This was never one vehicle caught alone in open ground. This was a coordinated push, 10 vehicles moving together, tanks providing armor and firepower while supporting vehicles carried troops and supplies, the exact kind of formation that used to represent genuine offensive strength earlier in this war. Ukraine's border guard units, the same forces responsible for defending the country's frontier but increasingly fighting directly along the front line with their own trained drone teams, watched that entire approach unfold and simply refused to let it reach its objective. One after another, the vehicles in that column were struck. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, even smaller support vehicles caught out in the open alongside them. According to reports from the drone units monitoring the attack, roughly 80% of the entire assault force never even reached Ukrainian frontline positions. They were destroyed, disabled, or forced to retreat before the attack accomplished anything meaningful at all. I want you to actually picture that for a moment. 10 armored vehicles, worth potentially millions of dollars combined, backed by trained crews, rolling forward with a specific tactical objective, and within minutes the overwhelming majority of that force simply stopped existing as a fighting unit. Not gradually worn down across hours of grinding combat, but rapidly, decisively, by weapons that cost a tiny fraction of what any single one of those vehicles represents. This is the uncomfortable math that keeps repeating itself across this entire war, and it's worth sitting with, honestly. A modern Russian tank, even an older T-72 upgraded with reactive armor and now an active protection system, still represents an enormous investment. Steel, engineering, training, fuel, maintenance, years of institutional knowledge poured into keeping a single vehicle combat ready. A single FPV drone, by comparison, can be assembled for a few $100s using parts available almost anywhere in the world. When a few $100s of technology can reliably defeat a machine worth potentially millions, you're not just looking at a tactical defeat anymore. You're looking at an entire category of weapon becoming economically unsustainable to keep using in the way Russia is currently using it. And here's a quick prediction for you before I move on, so keep it in mind as we go. I'd bet most military planners watching this footage in Washington, in Brussels, in Seoul, and in Beijing are drawing a very different conclusion than the one Russian state television wants its own citizens to draw. This isn't just a story about one column in Donetsk. Every modern army on Earth is currently deciding how much of its budget to pour into heavy armor versus cheap, expendable drones, and Mayorsk just became one more data point in that argument, whether the generals making those decisions ever say so publicly or not. And that's the deeper story hiding beneath this single piece of footage. It isn't really about one column near one small village most people outside this war will never hear of again. It's about what this failure represents for Russia's broader ability to keep fighting an armored war at all. Russia has lost a staggering number of tanks and armored vehicles since the invasion began. Numbers that would have seemed almost unthinkable at the outset. Decades of Soviet-era stockpiles ground down month after month, largely by exactly the kind of cheap aerial threat Arena M was supposed to finally solve. Russia still manufactures new tanks, but sanctions have cut off access to many of the high-precision Western components modern armored vehicles depend on, particularly for targeting systems and electronics, and replacement components sourced from elsewhere simply don't perform at the same level the originals once did. That helps explain something that puzzles a lot of outside observers. Why does Russia keep sending relatively old T-72 variants into attacks like this one, instead of its most advanced tank designs? Because if a decades-old T-72, upgraded with the newest active protection technology available, still falls to a homemade drone within seconds, sending an even more advanced, even more expensive vehicle into the same kill zone would represent an even bigger loss, and an even bigger propaganda disaster if it ends up filmed and shared exactly the same way. Quick thing before I keep going. If breakdowns like this, ones that actually explain the why behind the footage, instead of just showing you an explosion, are useful to you, tell me in the comments what part of this war you want covered next. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what I dig into. Now let's zoom out, because this single attack near Mayorsk didn't happen in isolation. It fits into a much larger, much more painful pattern that has defined this stretch of the front for months. The area around Pokrovsk and its neighboring town, Myrno Rad, has become one of the most fiercely contested pieces of ground in this entire war. Russian forces have thrown enormous resources at capturing territory here, treating it as a key strategic objective worth an extraordinary cost in both men and equipment, and time after time, Ukrainian defenders backed by exactly the kind of drone teams we just watched in action have made every meter of that ground brutally expensive to take. Earlier in this war, Russian commanders relied heavily on large mechanized columns pushing forward together in relatively open, direct assaults. Over time, as drone warfare made that approach increasingly costly, many units shifted towards smaller infiltration-style attacks, tiny groups moving on foot or motorcycles, trying to slip through gaps rather than smashing through them with armor. So watching Russia return to a larger mechanized column, complete with its newest defensive technology bolted onto the tanks, raises a genuinely interesting question. Was this a deliberate test of whether updated armor and the new Arena M system could finally make older tactics viable again? Was it a sign that commanders believed they had accumulated enough resources for a larger push? Or was it simply a costly gamble thrown at the wall to see if anything would stick, regardless of how badly similar attempts had gone before? Whatever the actual motivation was, the result speaks for itself. Nearly the entire attacking force was eliminated before it could achieve anything meaningful, and that is not the outcome of a well-resourced, carefully calculated offensive. That's the outcome of an attack that ran directly into the kind of layered drone defense that has defined this stretch of the war for months. By the time the drone teams finally stood down that evening, the field outside Mayorsk looked nothing like it had that morning. Where 10 vehicles had once moved forward in something close to formation, there were now scattered black shapes half sunk into the mud, thin columns of smoke bending sideways in the wind, and a silence that felt heavier than the noise that had come before it. Ukrainian soldiers reviewing the drone footage afterward described it less like a battle and more like a countdown, one strike, then another, until there was almost nothing left worth striking. There's an uncomfortable question worth sitting with here, one that goes beyond equipment and tactics entirely. What must it feel like to be a soldier ordered into a column like that, knowing, almost certainly, based on months of similar attempts across this exact stretch of front, that the odds of surviving the approach alone are stacked heavily against you? Some soldiers in this war have reportedly chosen to abandon positions rather than take part in attacks they viewed as effectively hopeless. Others follow orders anyway, whether out of discipline, fear of punishment from their own command, or simply because they see no better alternative. It's a genuinely difficult thing to think about. Real people on both sides of this war caught inside decisions made by commanders sitting far away from the actual point of contact. This pattern of grinding, costly attacks extends well beyond just this one column near Mayorsk, too. Ukrainian forces have documented drone strikes reaching remarkable distances behind the immediate battle zone, hitting supply vehicles, logistics, convoys, and support equipment dozens of kilometers from where the actual fighting is happening. Fiber optic controlled drones, immune to the electronic jamming both sides increasingly rely on to disrupt ordinary radio controlled systems, have proven especially effective at reaching these deeper targets. When a drone can reach a target 30 kilometers or more behind the front line, there is functionally no truly safe rear area left for Russian logistics anymore. No comfortable staging ground where vehicles and supplies can gather without real risk of being spotted and destroyed. That detail matters enormously for understanding the bigger picture here, because wars aren't only won or lost at the exact point where two front lines meet. They're won or lost in the supply chains behind those lines. The fuel, the ammunition, the replacement vehicles, and the reinforcements that keep an army capable of sustaining pressure over weeks and months rather than just days. If Ukrainian drones can reliably reach deep behind Russian lines and disrupt that supply chain, it doesn't just cost Russia a single damaged vehicle. It slowly strangles the entire system's ability to keep feeding fresh resources into attacks like the one that just failed near Mayorsk. If you're finding value in this kind of grounded, honest breakdown of what's actually happening here, do me a favor and share this with someone who cares about following this war properly. It genuinely helps this channel keep reaching people who want the real picture instead of just the highlight reel. So where does all of this actually leave us? What does one failed column near one small village in Donetsk tell us about the direction of this entire war? First, it tells us that Russia's search for a real technological answer to cheap drone warfare is still, even after everything, coming up short. Arena M represented years of promises, decades of development history stretching back to the Soviet era, and a genuine attempt to finally solve the single biggest problem plaguing Russian armor throughout this conflict. In its very first publicly documented real-world test against the exact threat it was built to counter, it failed completely, caught on camera, shared instantly, and analyzed by military experts around the world within hours. Second, it tells us that even when Russia attempts larger, more coordinated attacks backed by updated equipment and a real tactical plan, Ukraine's layered drone defenses remain capable of inflicting devastating, disproportionate losses. 80% of an attacking force failing to even reach its objective is not a minor tactical setback. That's the kind of result that should force serious questions inside Russian command about whether this approach is sustainable at all, no matter how much new technology gets bolted onto the tanks involved. And third, maybe most importantly, it tells us something about the wider trajectory of this entire war. This conflict has increasingly become a battle, not just between soldiers and territory, but between cost and value, between what a weapon costs to build and what it costs to destroy. Russia is currently pouring enormous resources, expensive tanks, trained crews, years of research into active protection technology, into attacks that are being defeated by drones built for a few $100s each. That math simply doesn't work in Russia's favor over the long term, no matter how much raw manpower or Soviet-era stockpile gets thrown at the problem. None of this means the war is close to some clean, decisive ending. Wars like this one rarely resolve through a single dramatic moment. They grind forward through exactly these kinds of accumulating failures, one destroyed column at a time, one failed defense system at a time, until the weight of it all becomes impossible for one side to sustain any longer. Whether that moment is close, or whether Russia finds new tactics, new technology, or simply enough raw resources to keep absorbing these losses for months or years to come, is something nobody can predict with total certainty right now. What I can tell you with real confidence is this. On one single stretch of ground near a small village, most people outside this war will never have heard of. 10 Russian vehicles rolled forward with real ambition, backed by genuine new technology, and within minutes, almost the entire attack simply ceased to exist. Not through some miracle weapon, not through some dramatic secret strategy, but through drones. Some of the cheapest, most accessible weapons in this entire war, doing exactly what they've been doing for years now, patiently, relentlessly turning some of the most expensive military hardware on the planet into burning wreckage on a muddy field in Donetsk. That's the story hiding underneath every one of these viral drone videos. Not just the explosion itself, but everything it represents about who is actually winning the deeper, quieter war being fought over cost, technology, and sustainability. And right now, based on everything documented near Mayorsk, that deeper war does not appear to be going the way Russian commanders keep insisting it is. I'll keep tracking this front line closely, and the moment there's real footage or real developments worth breaking down properly, I'll bring it straight to you. Because if there's one thing this entire war keeps proving over and over, in villages most of us will never be able to find on a map, it's that the side willing to adapt fastest, not the side with the most expensive hardware sitting in a parade square, is the side actually shaping how this conflict ends. If you want to make sure you don't miss that update, this is genuinely the moment to hit subscribe. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. Stay safe, keep asking the hard questions, and I wish you all a peaceful sky wherever you are watching from.